Howdy everybody. It is 2 p.m. on Tuesday, April 7th, and I have walked almost all the way to the lighthouse out at Race Point. Ran out of time, wanted to get going, and wanted to walk back towards the car. It is absolutely a gorgeous day out today. It's a little bit chilly, a bit of a breeze, but just perfect for walking. When I got here, the tide was high. I've been here for about an hour, and the tide has slowly gone out. I'll get up and kind of show you where we're at. So we are right at the tip of the fingers of the arm of Cape Cod. That lighthouse off in the distance is the Race Point Lighthouse, and then there's the marsh behind us, the Provincetown Inn, and then Pilgrim Monument that you can see there, more of the marsh, and then way down there is the old Coast Guard station, and then out into Cape Cod Bay. I don't know if you can see it, but way off in the distance is that right kind of in the center is the tower, that long cylindrical object. That is the power plant at the Cape Cod Canal. So we're just going to kind of do a stroll. Lots of birds. Brant, we saw a loon. We saw a whale when we first got here, blowing off in the distance. I could not tell you if it was a right whale or a humpback whale, and it was too far off to really tell, and I certainly couldn't show you with the camera, but we will keep an eye out for it. Since it's kind of low tide, I'm going to start over on the marsh side a little bit, and there's not another soul in sight. Tide's going out, so let's just see if we can find some stuff over here. You've got lots of this vegetation. The winter is over. A lot of these plants are starting to break up, so the vegetation is starting to pile up on the edge of the marsh. That, of course, will break down and create nutrients. I have a friend who has a site called A Year of Plastic on Instagram. You should follow it because she collects things like this on the beach and kind of does artwork with it. It's pretty fabulous, actually. Disappointing that she finds enough plastic to make art with, but still pretty cool art nonetheless, and brings a lot of attention to the plastic issue. Right now, many of you may or may not be seeing a profusion of gloves that people just take off and throw on the ground. That is not a good thing to do. We need to be more careful. It's just more litter that we want to try to reduce if we can. So I kind of walked out on the marsh here a little bit, some sand. Again, the water is really, really cold, so we don't see tons of stuff swimming around in it yet. No, not a lot of crabs or minnows or things like that. But it is really beautiful. There's lots of birds out here, but they're down in the grass. They're hard to see on this camera. Still really cool stuff. I've been looking to see if there's any holes where I might be able to show you a very common bivalve of the area. Don't see any. Hey, Alan. It's been a good walk out here. Saw some really cool stuff. Oh, here's kind of a cool animal that you're probably all familiar with. That's a periwinkle, right? We all seen a periwinkle before. That's another one right there. Many of you may or may not know that a periwinkle is actually edible. And when you're out on the beach, this is a good example. You can kind of find stuff, if you're like in Tracker, see that little kind of line in the sand? If you just follow it, at the end, there's usually something, right? Usually that thing is down in the mud or underneath when it's exposed. But here we've got a cool periwinkle that's just out and about. If you see his little eyes kind of poking out of the end, and it's chilly enough and moist enough he can be out and safe. They are food. They were eaten by the colonists. They were a pretty regular kind of part of a meal, along with eels. See, here's an example. So if we follow this little trail, now I can see that it looks like there might be something right here. Let's see. Maybe I might be wrong. No, nothing. Might have been where it started. You never know. But never hurts to dig in the sand, see what you might find. That's the whole name of the game, right? Is exploring, seeing what you can find, getting out and interacting with nature. Hello, Jessica. So just walk a little bit along. Not a lot down here. I'm actually surprised. This is kind of the type of area where normally we would find a lot of bivalves, but I'm also seeing evidence that the sand has moved around quite a bit this winter. So maybe those patches where they are may have been moved. Oh, here's something kind of cool. So the marsh is built upon a material called peat. You can tell how old a marsh is by how deep the peat is. It takes about 1,000 years to make a foot of peat, but that peat also breaks down and breaks apart and sometimes washes up. And here is a good example of a chunk of peat that broke off in the marsh. You can see that it's all vegetable matter, right? It's the roots and the parts of plants that are breaking down. The holes are done by mussels or crabs or clams, and that helps to aerate the marsh. The marsh is one of the most rich biomass areas on the whole planet. If you were to take a square cube of the salt marsh and measure all the things that were alive in it and weigh it, and then you were to take, say, a square foot of the jungle and weigh that, the salt marsh has actually the largest amount of biomass of any of that stuff. So again, we talked about plastic. Sometimes we think of plastic in little terms. Here's a big piece of plastic. Looks like a buoy. Probably the mooring, somebody's mooring that broke free. This is where somebody would have tied up their boat. It's filled with this kind of foamy plastic material, and that's a pretty big chunk of litter. We find that kind of stuff on the beaches all the time. We have found a number of lobster traps up here today, as well as just bits and pieces of plastic and rope and things like that. There's actually, we're going to walk by it, kind of a neat little sculpture garden up there that we're going to see. The other cool thing is lots of rocks. We talked one day about how the Cape is a glacial till, right? So these rocks have been bounced around in the current and in the surf, and they become very smooth and flat. So let's go down here. We'll see if we can skip these rocks. Again, lots of birds. I'm not sure. We'll get closer. We'll see if those are brant or geese. The other thing we see a lot of on this beach are these kind of clams right here. So bivalve, a surf clam. They get really big, and they're kind of a deep water clam. But when they die, they wash up on these beaches right here. So I'm going to get a little wet, I think, for you guys. And that's okay. So just keep in mind that when I got here, where I'm standing right now is where the water was. And that was about an hour ago. And now it's out there. So the tide moves out very quickly. The thing to remember is that the tide moves in just as quickly. So when you're out here on the beaches, you have to kind of pay attention to that. So I'm going to walk across the ripples here. The water's cold. Got my hiking shoes on, so I'm gonna get a little wet. That's okay. It's supposed to be waterproof. We're gonna get down close to the water. Oh, I wanted to show you this too. So the sand here is kind of ground up rocks. Get these neat rocks like this. This is quartz, right? You could polish this up and shine it up if you want to. Jessery, this is at Race Point up in Provincetown. It's a great time of the year to come. There is not a soul to be seen, right? So we've got all these, and then we've got this interesting rock right in the middle. That's right. That's an old piece of parking lot. When a parking lot washed out into the sea during a storm, we find lots of those around here. All right. One more little bit over to the sand. Boom. Here we go. So I've got two rocks I'm going to try to skip. Nice flat one, a little bit of heft. See if we can make this happen. Camera in one hand, stone in the other. Okay, ready? Here we go. Woo, that was pretty good. Did you see that? Here's another. Not so good. Oh, awesome. Awesome, awesome. We talked about jellyfish the other day. Does anybody remember when we talked about jellyfish? We talked about how lion's mane are kind of common in the cold waters, and I have just found one here on the beach. It's very distinct that it's a lion's mane because of the coloration. It's upside down, but if we get in close, we can see the tentacles on the lion's mane, right? We can see the middle kind of fluffy parts of the tentacles. I'm not going to touch it because I could still potentially get stung. I've already been stung by one. Let's see if we look behind the rock. There we go. With the rock as the background, we get a really good look at one of the tentacles. If we looked at it under a microscope, we would see that they're covered with thousands of nematocysts, which are little stinging cells. And so even though this is on the beach and it is probably dead, those cells can still sting us. So we do not want to handle this and potentially get stung. That would be a very bad thing. Some really cool tentacles right there as well. That's pretty awesome to find. That's another indication that spring is kind of coming. We don't find those right away in the winter. Whew, let me get brushed off. And again, when we come out here, we never know what we're going to find. We might find nothing at all. We might find cool things like that. So let's continue on walking. Though that was really cool. I liked finding that. There are these big jellyfish called cannonball jellyfish that you may find if you're down on the beaches in South Carolina, and they have a really hard top. And those jellyfish are actually edible. People eat those. They pickle them or dehydrate them. So that's an interesting thing. So I don't know if you can see those birds flying out there. So those are white birds with black wingtips. The big ones are gannets. So those are actually related to the boobies that down south, and they are a pretty big bird, and they eat by flying up and then torpedoing down into the water and getting sometimes as much as 10 feet down into the water to catch fish. They're a pretty cool bird, and there are times out here when certain fish are running when they will literally just be thousands of them diving down into the water. It is pretty amazing. So we're going to be up in the sculpture area pretty soon, so I'll hop back over to that side in a minute. Still looking to see what I might find on the beach. So there's a better kind of rack line up there. A rack line being where the tide kind of turns when it's high tide. It kind of beats there for a little while before it turns and goes back out. So lots of stuff ends up being washed up on the rack line. Coming up to a little break. See a lot of seagulls here. I grew up here, so I don't find seagulls to be that fascinating, but I know that other people do. Hold on. Nope, nothing. Oh, there they go. So the brown ones are juveniles. They're only in their first year. They're last year's chicks. And so they kind of have to hang out with the adults and get whatever scraps they can. All right. Walk across the water here. Really clear. Really cold. And look at this, is moving right along. Let's see if I can jump over this. See? Not so bad. Pretty spry for 51, I would say. Let's see what else. More parking lot. More rocks. Lots and lots of rocks. Let's go over here. Start heading up to the beach where the rack line is. So there's some folks out here walking a dog. Interesting to note that you are not supposed to have an animal out here at all. So, you know, this is the off season. I'm not going to have any confrontation with them, but, you know, it is what it is. This is a pretty fragile environment, so we want to have less interaction with it if we can. With as far as animals go, you know, dogs will chase some mice and things like that. So there's a lobster trap that probably broke free in a storm and washed up. If it wasn't absolutely completely frigid, I would get in the water and see what's attached to that. But we are coming to a spot, kind of a tide pooly spot, but we'll be able to look at some creatures. Again, we're not having a lot of crabs right now. We don't have any horseshoe crabs kind of kicking around yet. But what we do have are smaller creatures and different types of plants that are starting to kind of come into their own. It is just so beautiful out today. So beautiful. Again, right, like an Indian tracker. Right? Seagull, goose, probably seagull. So you can see that they've been here and they've been feeding. One of the great things about what I do is I get to come out here and interact with nature on a regular basis. I like to think I have a decent knowledge of kind of what's going on, but I'm also always learning. One of the discussions that we have quite a bit is about global climate change, or what some people call climate disruption. And naturalists tend to be kind of a little bit more knowledgeable about that kind of stuff. For instance, we've kept track over a lot of years when the pussy willows first bud, or when the first daffodils bloom. And I just read some research that said that robins are now migrating here almost 20 years earlier than they used to. So nature is reacting in a way to compensate for it getting warmer sooner, that sort of stuff, even though we may want to argue or politicize it. It is science. There is a tendency for the globe to be getting a little warmer, and we're going to have to deal with the repercussions of that for sure. So there's some cool birds up here. I might get a good look. Some crazy wild animals over here on the rocks. This one's kind of got a blue, it looks like a mating coat almost, though I don't know if it's old enough to be mating yet. but it's just a crazy animal. I don't know. Does it belong in this environment? I'm not sure. So this is all water that's left behind when the tide goes out. So technically, it is a tide pool. And in the summer, it would be full of kids and people all interacting with it. But I want to get to a spot that's a little still and show you some cool animals that are in here right now. So here's kind of a good spot, right? So we've got this bit of algae right here, right? There's a couple of different things going on in there. If you can see that orange bundle, that's actually not algae. That's actually a live group of animals, a hydrozoan or bryozoan. I'm not sure which one it would be, but those are living animals, and they're in there with some brown algae as well. You can also see there's a track of an animal there, kind of like a V-shaped track. I'm not sure what animal that is, probably a snail, but that's kind of in here right now. We've got some nice bright green sea lettuce, which is starting to really pop now as the days are longer and the water starts to warm up a little bit. Another type of brown algae in the middle there, right? So these algae are starting to grow, and these hydrozoans to grow, and now there's going to be a whole bunch of that come underneath those as well. Now there's that green algae that you can see there as well. That green algae is actually called codium. That's a introduced species, and then I'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to show you this big long brown strand of algae. So I have a gentleman who works with me named Gil Newton, and he is a phycologist, or a scientist who studies algae. That's a sea whip, and the sea whips only start coming in when the temperature gets to a certain point. Again, sea whips are starting to come earlier and earlier than they used to. So that's an important algae to watch. So back to the codium. The codium is an invasive species of seaweed. They tend to be in a little bit of the warmer water. So if you're on the south side of the Cape, you might pick up a stone or a shell, and it will be absolutely covered with a big piece of codium. And these are not good, because one of the things they attach to are scallops, and then the scallops cannot escape their predators. So I'm going to come up on these little black ducks here, and I think these are brant. So this is the southern kind of most point of their range, and in a few days, weeks, they will be heading back north. They summer and nest in the Arctic waters, and then beyond them, I doubt you'll be able to see it on my camera. I'm going to show you another bird. These guys are letting me get fairly close. I don't know if you can see the ring around their neck. That's kind of their black head, and ring around their neck is their kind of distinguishing feature. And then off beyond them, we're going to give it a minute to pop up, was a loon. Again, loons are kind of a winter bird here, and they head off and do their own thing. He's here diving, probably catching fish and minnows, and then heading back. He'll be flying north soon too, to go to the areas. I don't know if you can see him. It's really low on the water. See him there? That's a loon right over there. So that's kind of a cool find to see as well. So it seems like the beach is fairly desolate right now, but in fact, there's a lot of life going on. I'm going to go back up towards the rack line that we talked about. I found a couple of neat rocks, if you're a rock person. Look at that. Neat with those two little lines. I wonder, where that came from. This was all deposited by the Laurentide Glacier that was here 10 to 15,000 years ago. So these rocks were either scraped down from up north or dragged up from down south. We have a mix of rocks from all different sorts of places. All right, so we're kind of back up here on the Rackline area. Back to see the marsh over there. Pilgrim Monument just peeping up. Let's see what we might see. So we've got this shell. This is a slipper snail, so called because it looks like a slipper. We've talked many times about how things tend to be named after what they look like. Sometimes this is also a place where we might find bones. Last year, a whale washed up nearby. I tried to walk out to it, but the smell was so incredibly disgusting, I couldn't even get fairly close. And as a guy who sometimes deals with dead stuff in the course of his job, it was pretty horrible. So again, we talked about some of the dune plants starting to come to life. This is a very common local dune plant finally showing its face. These are things that hold the dune together. Another lobster trap that washed up, that broke free and washed up. Sometimes people come around and collect them. Oh, here's something kind of interesting, right? We look for evidence of stuff. Here is somebody's meal, right? Not sure what kind of bird this is.